So hello and welcome to another episode of Geographics. I'm your interim host, Carl Smallwood. Yes, that is my real name. And today we're talking about Central Park and Seneca Village, a tale of two New Yorks. And this video is based on an original article submitted to us by James CJ. If they've provided us with social media links, they will be listed below alongside my own. Also, I'm now just noticing the humorous juxtaposition of a guy called Carl Smallwood talking about a massive park. So, home to over 8.3 million people, New York City is, as often described, the city that never sleeps, where life never stops and people are always on the move. In the 1840s, a proposal was put forward to create a large park in central Manhattan to serve the surrounding areas with an adequate green oasis in an otherwise concrete jungle. Spanning some 840 acres in Manhattan and visited by over 42 million people annually, the creation of Central Park was not without sacrifice. As planning and construction began, numerous existing structures were seized using eminent domain, displacing thousands in the hopes of creating the park. The most famous, or perhaps infamous example of this was Seneca Village, a majority black settlement. Central Park and Seneca Village represent a tale of two New Yorks, one of the United States' most diverse cities and a city that grappled with the racial divide in a post-slavery 19th and 20th century America. Also, if it wasn't already clear, this video will be tackling some pretty heavy topics, so viewer discretion is advised. The first half of the 19th century saw New York City's population growing exponentially, quadrupling between 1821 and 1855. Manhattan was experiencing this fair share of growth, with the borough growing from the water's edge further up north. So New York City in the 19th century shares some similarities with the New York City of today. It was also a bustling city where noise and chaos existed around every corner. To escape the hustle and bustle of lower Manhattan, people would often find spaces to relax and enjoy a quieter slice of New York City life. The appetite for a new large park grew equally as exponentially during the first half of the 19th century. Many saw it as an opportunity to improve the city, promote commercial and physical health, and correct the disorder and chaos that would naturally present itself in a giant bustling metropolis. In 1811, the Commissioner's Plan was released and detailed what would become the modern street grid of New York City, now known for centuries. At the time, Central Park wasn't part of the plan, but that was about to change. So by 1840, demand for a larger public space was becoming more and more evident, especially considering the elite were leading the charge. It would take years for these calls to turn to action, as bureaucracy and red tape made it far from an easy endeavour. In 1851, for example, Mayor Ambrose Kingsland appealed to the NYC Common Council that a new large park in Manhattan was not just necessary, but beneficial for the city overall. At the time, the idea of the Common Council appropriating money to construct a large public park was unprecedented. Still, he continued his advocacy, which led to the proposal being moved around local government to the Committee of Lands. Eventually, they endorsed the concept, making it official. A new park was coming to New York City. The initial park would reside on Jones Wood, a farmland overlooking the East River in Manhattan. These plans faced heavy opposition from the Jones and the Schmererhorn, who rejected selling their estates to the city. Of course, the city responded with attempts to take the land through eminent domain. At the foremost of this bill was Senator James Beckman, the leading voice campaigning for Jones Wood Park. Beckman's reasons for supporting this location for a park weren't because it met all of his criteria, but because it was adjacent to his own land, and he believed it would enhance his property value. Politicians gonna politic. While objections were being made against Jones Wood Park, the idea of a central park was gaining traction. In 1851, talk of a larger, grander park were discussed and advertised for central Manhattan. Many believed a larger, more central park would have far more economic and cultural benefits than a sectional one. The Jones Wood saga was becoming, should we say, messy. Support for it came crashing down. Adding to Beckman's woes were the families who owned Jones Wood. They took the matter to court and won, because money, rendering the seizure of the estates unconstitutional. Despite this loss, the city continued looking for new ways to approach the subject. However, eventually they changed their minds, as the idea of Central Park in Manhattan was becoming easier and a far more appealing option. The site desired for this new Central Park would actually end up being cheaper, despite taking up more actual land mass, because the area they chose would be impractical, if not impossible, to actually build a building up. Specifically, the irregular topography and ravines that ran through were perfect for something else: a public green space for the people. There were a few problems right off the bat though. The city needed to convince the public that the site in question could be rehabilitated and serve as a beautiful park. Democrats swept the local elections in 1852 when they tabled all talk of Jones Wood. Not that everyone stopped plotting. On June 21st, 1853, the Central Park Bill was officially introduced in the state legislature. The fight between these two locations were getting uglier by the day, and despite numerous issues with both park bills, they eventually passed both chambers of the state Congress. Not that they'd both be built. Not long after the passing, Jones Wood Bill was struck down by a judge yet again, enraging its supporters, especially Beckman, who, remember, just wanted to increase his own property value, so screw him. The Jones Wood plan was dead, and there was no coming back this time. Central Park had won the battle and was now ready to move forward in its planning. But like the process of getting the project approved, it was far from smooth sailing. While Jones Wood was dead and the Central Park was moving forward, the city would start running into new hurdles that put the park's future up for debate. 1853 saw the formation of a new movement led by New York City's elite. The reform movement decried the government's excessive spending and taxes, up 54% in the last 3 years. Then there were the revelations by the grand jury that New York City was, would you believe it, a hotbed for corruption. To cap things off, there was an economic downturn in 1854, which would end in the Panic of 1857. By all measures, New York City was a mess. Politically, financially, morally. This all resulted in a reform government being elected composed of Reform Democrats and Whigs. Central Park was steadily getting worse, and the idea of this massive 800-acre park was becoming heavily scrutinised. In March of 1855, the Board of Councilmen voted 14-3 to decrease the park's size by 400 feet on each side, and both the lower 12 blocks. Thankfully, this was vetoed by the then mayor, Fernando Wood, no relation. His reasons were largely self-serving, having owned land near the proposed site, but that was neither here nor there. Again, politicians gone politic. Beyond his own interest in the park, Wood saw the potential for it to usher in a new age in New York City on its journey to greatness. He also saw it as a way to get people working during a recession. He wasn't wrong, but many fights were still being had over the construction of Central Park. The next major battle was the land itself. New York City was undertaking an act of eminent domain never before seen. The land that Central Park would occupy was currently home to more than 1,600 people, mostly African Americans and poor immigrants. Reshaping Upper Manhattan and transforming New York City would come at a price for those with the softest voices by law. Before Central Park redefined what Upper Manhattan was, it was home to various autonomous settlements. At the time, these were considered rural districts, which weren't entirely accurate. It was a very different time back then in mid-19th century. Most people resided in Lower Manhattan, close to water, as that's how the settlements of New York began. These rural districts comprise a majority of immigrants and black residents, making up over 55% of the population. The immigrant share of this was 53.6%, mirroring citywide demographics. The residents of Upper Manhattan were far less affluent than those of New York City's residents. This was measured in the percentage of landowners and the number of people per dwelling. Many painted Upper Manhattan as a collection of shanty towns, which was inaccurate and, let's be honest, a bit racist. In 1953, when the Central Park Bill was passed, land and property assessments were conducted and completed in July of 1955. In total, the land commissioners conducted over 3,400 lot assessments. This resulted in a few new challenges, as the price tag for the land alone ballooned from $1.7 million to $5 million, and eventually that $5 million grew to $7.39 million, the equivalent of $232 million today. And that's just to get the land, not turn it into a park. And of course, not everyone would benefit from the land acquisition process. Historically, settlements within the desired park lines were maligned as low-class, dirty, and crowded, which, as mentioned, wasn't entirely accurate or fair, and, again, bit racist. The people living in these areas were often referred to as squatters. The most famous of these settlements was by far Seneca Village, a neighbourhood made up of free African Americans and Irish immigrants. The story behind this neighbourhood is one of fascination and tragedy. The story of Seneca Village starts in 1825 with John and Elizabeth Whitehead. They owned a fair portion of the farmland between 83rd and 88th Street. The couple subdivided their land into some 200 lots and began selling them off. The first buyer was Andrew Williams, an African-American shoe shiner who purchased 3 lots for $125. From there, lots were continuously bought over the next 2 decades, creating a community unlike any other in New York City. So Seneca Village is a community that is lost to history. We don't have all the facts, but more of a collection of clues and assumptions. For example, evidence suggests that Seneca Village residents had gardens, raised livestock, procured water from the Tanner Spring, and likely fished in the Hudson River, but we don't know for sure. As the decades rolled on, the 10 homes in 1833 had grown to over 50 by the mid-1850s. It's also important to understand that at the time Seneca Village existed, New York State had abolished slavery in 1827, but this didn't mean public sentiment towards newly freed African Americans was kind. Prejudice and discrimination remained a problem. Can you believe it? This wasn't lost on the Irish immigrants either, who faced a different form of prejudice that nonetheless resulted in them being, treated poorly by people who would. In the bustling areas of Lower Manhattan, you could feel the prejudice and the limitations New York City offered. Seneca Village was almost then like an oasis where life was more peaceful and prosperous for, people who didn't want to deal with that. Evidence suggests that African American residents of Seneca Village lived in a more prosperous and stable environment than other African Americans in the city. Their kids attended school, everyone was working, there was a thriving church, many residents were property owners, and this almost entirely contradicts the accounts provided during the 18th century that residents residing in Central Park's desired boundaries were squatters living in makeshift shanty towns, which again was a bit racist. Instead, many of these residents worked, paid taxes, had decent homes, and lived quiet, respectable lives. But it was clear the point of these characterizations was to garner support for what was about to happen. The area designated for the future Central Park was home to some 1,600 people, as mentioned, including the roughly 255 residents of Seneca Village. Many of these settlements weren't as unique as Seneca Village, which was not only the biggest of these settlements, but was also a multicultural, integrated community. It comprised 2/3 African Americans, 1/3 Irish, and a couple of German immigrants sprinkled throughout. When Central Park became more of a reality, Seneca Village was one of the many settlements seized through eminent domain. While the people living there were paid for their land, the issue remained that their opportunities outside of Seneca Village were not as favourable as they were within it. The residents of these various communities were told to vacate by 1857. This led to the residents of Seneca Village being displaced, forgotten, and sadly lost to history. However, in the 1990s, nearly a century and a half later, historians did begin uncovering the remains of the village, buried quite literally in the dirt of the park that was laid on top of it. To design the forthcoming Central Park, Mayor Wood, again no relation, created and appointed a consulting board to handle this aspect of the park's formation. The amazingly named Egbert Ludoviscus Vale was hired to be the park's chief engineer. During his tenure, he conducted a topographical survey and even devised his visions for the park. Unfortunately, it wouldn't come to fruition after new members were added to the commissioner's board, thanks to legislation from the state Congress. They took over and got him to complete his survey before letting him go. Presumably, like myself, they just didn't want to keep saying his name out loud. Instead of going with Vale's concept for Central Park, the commission opened it up to the public. He held a contest to design the park. The Greenswood plan by architects and landscape designer Calvert Vaux and Frederick Law Olmsted was chosen. While some alterations were made to the winning design, the bulk of their vision came to be the final vision of Central Park. With the design coming into focus, it was time to get to work creating this major city project. The construction of Central Park began in 1858, and it was no easy task, and at the helm were several professionals to ensure everything went according to plan, including Vaux, Olmsted, and board member Andrew Halswell Green, aptly named. Central Park would take over 15 years to build, and the process was long and had many steps. The first significant step was draining all the marshes and swamps. They also had to remove unwanted rocks, which proved stubborn. To tend to their rocky terrain issue, they used gunpowder to oust the rugged rock, ultimately removing 5 million cubic yards of rocks, earth, and topsoil. They also had to bring in 1 million cubic yards of topsoil to ensure things grew and survived in the park. As mentioned, Central Park took some 15 years to build, and some 20,000 men worked on making the park an early version of what we know today. The project employed no black or female employees and mostly relied on immigrants, mainly of Irish origins. Labourers working in the park were often underpaid and had to work multiple jobs just to survive. The early days of the park's construction were marred by funding issues, but these managed to be resolved over time. It's like even just the little details, like, did you at least hire some black people to work on this so they could earn some money? No. Okay. By the time the park was completed, it had cost $14 million, which would be the equivalent of $520 million today, adjusted for inflation. This was a far cry from the initially agreed upon $5 million price tag. During the project's construction, the ballooning budget caused revisions to the plan, with some aspects being downsized. Money would continue to be an issue for Central Park as political upheaval took over New York. In 1861, Olmsted officially left the project due to consistent clashes with the commissioners. Not long after, in 1863, Vaux resigned too. At the heart of both departures was Chief Commissioner Green. Green was an intense figure when it came to the park building. He was a notorious micromanager, but more importantly, he lacked the architectural skill of the newly departed Vaux and Olmsted. Regardless, he forged ahead, accelerating construction of the park. What could possibly go wrong? During the 1860s, Central Park began gaining popularity, with attendance reaching nearly 3 million visitors per year. Green convinced Vaux and Olmsted to return in July of 1865. For several years, progress on the park was smooth. Unfortunately, in the early 1870s, Tammany Hall was a political force in New York. This corrupt political machine was often considered a dark force in New York politics. In 1868, Tammany Hall took control over the state of New York for decades, up until 1935. This will be one of the primary causes of Central Park's various brushes with disaster. Starting in 1870, Tammany Hall took over Central Park, and their boss, Representative William Tweed, abolished the commission and replaced it with the Tammany members and a powerless Green. This resulted in the second departure of Vaux and Olmsted. This period, albeit brief, was quite destructive for the park. Planted trees were dug up and taken to other parks, trees were over-pruned, and overall maintenance was disregarded. They even planned to build numerous buildings in the park, which wouldn't come to pass thanks to a scandal that rocked New York. So whispers of missing funds from the city's treasury in 1871 led directly to Tweed. This resulted in an embezzlement scandal landing him in prison. It was estimated that Tweed and his cohorts had stolen over $45 million from the city. After he was arrested, the duo returned for a third time with a new board that favoured Olmsted. I wonder why. The Tammany Hall fiasco was far from over though. With all overall disgrace, their power was still alive and well, and they'd managed to get numerous people elected under the Reform Tammany banner. Their corruption was far more restrained and less noticeable, so worse. But they still wanted to plunder and use Central Park for all it was worth. To get their way, they'd need to remove Green, who'd become the city's auditor for the finance department in charge of audits and supervising expenditures. Green even became Olmsted's most powerful ally in government, ensuring he could complete Central Park in a fraught political environment that constantly made it difficult. The political fight behind the scenes raged on for years. Finally, in 1876, Central Park was completed, but Tammany Hall wasn't done messing with the jewel of New York City just yet. With attendance in Central Park consistently growing, maintenance costs for the facilities and grounds increased too. Unfortunately, Tammany Hall was still in power, and they neglected the park and slashed its budget, partly due to public pressure for citywide budget cuts. On top of that, the park was experiencing its own isolated issues, such as a rise in suicides. 1879, the situation had reached its crescendo. The reason for this decline can be pinpointed to several factors, including maintenance costs, politics, park workers, corruption, and real estate owners. So just going to wash over that suicide thing then, I suppose. This continued into the 20th century, with cars becoming more common and the New York City subway system opening. The new subway system allowed New Yorkers to seek out other destinations for nature and leisure, like Broadway or Coney Island. While there were attempts by leaders to ensure Central Park was well maintained and restored, the indifference from successive Tammany Hall Democratic mayors meant that the problem would continue to spiral. During the early 20th century, several park advocacy groups emerged, fighting to keep the parks as parks. These advocacy groups managed to fend off proposals to build things like a library, a stadium, a cultural centre, or an underground parking lot, and more ideas that would ruin the main concept behind Central Park. And that's just like, that's such, oh God, I hate that. Like, the city I live in, Sheffield, it's known as the UK's greenest city, and every single day there's like a thing through my letterbox from like some member of the government proposing like, why don't we cut down all these useless trees and build more car parks? And everyone who lives here is like, stop doing that. We don't want car parks, we want trees. It's like, but trees don't make money. They cost money. You've got to pay someone to prune them. Car parks make us money. It's like, oh, I hate it. Renovations to the park were planned in 1927 by Herman W. Merkel, hired by then Mayor Jimmy Walker. Unfortunately, the Great Depression hindered much of the $1 million plan, which would have seen 8 new playgrounds, fences, rehabilitated paths, and more minor fixes. Some of these plans were implemented, such as the underground irrigation system. It would take another decade and a half to get the rehabilitation of Central Park fully underway. Fast forward to 1934, and the newly elected Republican mayor and very Italian-sounding Fiorello LaGuardia unified the numerous park departments and appointed Robert Moses to clean up not only Central Park, but other parks and the department as a whole. This meant getting rid of Tammany-era politicians Finally, when Moses stepped into the position, the situation at the park was, to put it lightly, kinda dire. Trees were dying or already dead, weeds were everywhere, monuments had been heavily vandalised, walkways and equipment were broken, and ironwork was rusted. It was, in short, a disaster. Moses took on the challenge and rehabilitated the park to its former glory while making numerous improvements, including creating the Central Park Zoo. Other improvements included expanding the roads, adding 21 playgrounds, creating an ice skating rink, and more. Most of this was made possible from funds made available through the New Deal passed by FDR. In May of 1960, Moses left his post, leaving behind a legacy of being both a miracle worker and a controversial figure in New York City history. Moses is credited for saving Central Park and drastically improving it. The 1960s were the start of the so-called events era for the park, which saw events like Shakespeare in the Park, performances by the New York Philharmonic Orchestra, rallies, and even the Central Park Be-ins, which was part of the hippie movement. For nearly 2 decades, Central Park was stable. Unfortunately, this wouldn't last forever. The mid-1970s saw Central Park experience its second decline. The decline was obvious due to vandalism, general neglect, erosion, tree decay, and more issues similar to those in the 1920s, if not somewhat worse. In 1979, Elizabeth Barlow was chosen to head the Central Park Task Force to restore the grounds to their former glory once again. She worked alongside the newly formed Central Park Conservancy, a non-profit organisation comprising mostly of private citizens who just wanted the park to not be full of dog. The Central Park Conservancy organisation managed to do incredible work on the park for several decades. They renovated the Central Park Zoo and several other structures, restored landscapes, removed signs of vandalism, and took on numerous other smaller fixes. The restoration plan was working, and people were noticing the efforts made by Barlow and the organisation. In 1985, they began the 15-year restoration plan to restore landmarks, which saw numerous private investments helping to aid the efforts to restore the park to its former glory once again. These renovations to the park would drag into the first decade of the 21st century and cost some $550 million. The restoration of East Meadow marked the end of a 31-year restoration effort. Today, Central Park welcomes millions of visitors yearly and has become an iconic symbol of New York City, one of the world's most well-known parks. Home to a variety of fauna and flora, this natural landscape has constantly been referred to as the lungs of the city. Central Park is the epicenter of natural features in the Manhattan borough and what most New Yorkers think of when it comes to getting in touch with nature. After decades of neglect, Central Park enjoys, shall we say, far better treatment today than it has numerous times throughout its 166 years of existence. Renovations are constantly taking place, ensuring the park never experiences a decline like it did in the 20th century. Of course, politics have a way of creeping into public projects and maintenance, so history can repeat itself. Should it ever happen, let's hope that New York is more prepared this time. So thank you for tuning into this episode of Geographics. As noted at the start, I have been your host, Carl Smallwood, and this video is based on an original article submitted by James CJ. Links to both of our socials can be found on screen or below. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like. If you've got any comments about it, leave a comment. In particular, about my hosting and presentation style, which I'm trying to, figure out for the most part. I have my own channel, Fact Theme with Carl Smallwood, and Wiki Weekends, which has an altogether more relaxed and casual tone, and it's I'm finding it difficult to strike a balance between that and the more serious tone, better tone, by my predecessor Samuel Whistler, who we wish all the best. Either way, I hope you enjoyed this video. Subscribe for more content like this. Leave some suggestions for stuff you might want us to cover in future in the comments, alongside comments telling me to get a haircut. And as always, have the day you all deserve. Cheers. Also, feel free to make as many Smallwood Park jokes as you want. I've heard them all.